Tales of Atlantis by Joe B. Chapter 3. Read by the author, Joe B. Chapter 3. Stumbles. He did not seem odd to me at the time, although if I should have encountered him in any kind of context with which I was familiar, I certainly would have thought him odd. He certainly was not dressed in any way you or I would dress. Yet, for this deserted beach, he seemed to be in the right place. I certainly was able to see that I was in his world, not he in mine. His hair was wild, dark, growing down long over his shoulders. His skin was deeply tanned, but somehow not dark. His eyes were kind, not sure how else to describe it. He had a patient look about him, as if he'd been watching me for hours. He was in a kind of a crouch, which seemed comfortable for him. His face seemed, well, ageless. Not young, certainly, but somehow not old. He was bearded, but in a light, thin beard, not heavy. I could tell he'd had a difficult life, as his skin was wrinkled and toughened. I thought I could detect remnants of ancient scars on his body, but his toughened skin revealed little about the details of his past. Yet there was a quiet contentment about him that I immediately liked. I felt safe once I saw him, and the feeling of dread, almost terror, immediately left me. Here at least was a companion. Here at least was life. We just remained there for a bit, watching each other. His face went from my face to the can, and then back to my face. He seemed almost as interested in the can as in me. He was patient and did not move until I tried to speak. I wanted to ask where we were. Where were my friends? Can he help me find my way back? Many questions rushed through my mind, I can recall, but which I was going to utter first I had forgotten. Yet when the first sound began to exit my throat, he made a sharp, immediate motion with his hand, which cut me off. Then he hummed, a low, steady, comforting hum. I do not know why, but it comforted me. It seemed to be the type of sound a young mother gives her troubled infant as she cradles him in her arms. A soothing hum, which trails off in a kind of a down pitch, and seemed to me at the time to communicate a kind of universal sympathy and comfort to me. A human thing, which crossed the boundaries of worlds from which we came and reached me, easing me. It was only then that I began to feel tired. When I got down from my rotted log, he stood and slightly faced away from me, watching me over his shoulder. When I grabbed my can and my laptop and walked over to him, his gaze left my eyes and went to my hands. He seemed sad then, watching my hands. I remember thinking that I had brought belongings, possessions, and that he had none, only a kind of a skirt made from dried grasses. Perhaps he wanted one, and felt the lack of possessions, I thought. I offered him the can, and he recoiled visibly. He watched me with a frightened look for a moment, but one that instead conveyed a sense of dire concern. He leaned down and patted the sand beneath him. I laid the coffee can down and rose again. He gestured to my laptop, gripped securely in my other hand, and to the sand, but I would not part with it. I held it against my body, and he seemed to understand. He looked at me for what seemed to be a long while, perhaps more than 10 minutes, with an expression of pity and weariness, but I would not give away this last trace of my identity, my world, my obligations. He finally relented, I guess, for he turned and slowly walked straight into the forest. I struggled to keep up with him, branches slapping my face and legs. He made good speed considering he was walking, but I stumbled along barely able to see him, following instead the sounds he made as he walked, bare feet against leaves as the swish of ferns and foliage against his smooth skin. At one point I fell off balance into branches and struggled. I was about to cry out for help, but like the first time I tried to make noise, the moment a bit of breath left my mouth with voice attached, he seemed to be there, helping me to my feet, and again sounding that humming of concern, that falling off sound of a mother to her poor lost and tormented child. It was the only sound I heard him make that long walk through the forest, and a long walk it was. There were several times he comforted me in this way, but I began to find my legs after that first stumble, and I found that I never again fell like that again. The trick seemed to me not to think where you were walking. When I focused on walking, I would stumble and nearly fall, but when I began to empty my mind, the way seemed clear. It was my first lesson. The path was long and winding, and I would later learn that there were much shorter and more convenient paths to that rotted log. Yet he chose this one perhaps to draw my concentration. He was helping me learn something important. Sometimes in life, when a person thinks too much about a problem, the solution avoids him. It's as if you're chasing after a butterfly with your mind. When you lay down, it will land on your nose and find you, but while you run, it'll forever be out of your reach. There seemed to be something along these lines which he was slowly imparting to me on that journey. One thing which I learned very quickly was how encumbering was my laptop to my progress. I easily understood why he wanted me to leave the water can. Even on the flat beach, my one hand guarding the can and the other holding onto the laptop, my balance was precarious and my walking difficult. Here it would have been impossible for me to have had any balance in this type of lengthy dance house before me. He had no possessions and moved easily through the challenges. I was forever hindered, as if the hand I dedicated to my laptop was not present at all, and every branch and vine that encountered me on that side of my body pushed me awkwardly back. With this possession I moved one step back for every 3 steps forward. I saw the weary, pitying expression on his face many times that afternoon. It was growing dark when my feet found themselves walking without the dodging, scrambling motion they'd become accustomed to during the trek through the forest. I had quieted my mind towards the end of the journey, not thinking about the proper placement of footsteps, strategy, and objectives, and with more of an intuitive focus on balance, thus moved much more easily forward. I seemed to develop a sense of anticipation of the obstacles ahead in the quiet of my mind. I became finally more of a fluid than an object. My body was more a verb moving through the world, my consciousness the only stability as the body moved through the moving world. I became agile, but my laptop continued to catch branches and vines, entangling itself from time to time. But I kept up with the pace of the gentle man that led me. At last the jungle began to dissipate more into manageable foliage. I could see yards ahead of me now instead of feet. My spirit began to soar as I thought of rest for my tired legs and thirsty body. This man had led me to safety. I had finally entered a clearing, at the end of which lay several thatched huts, arranged in a semicircle around a central fire pit. Hammocks hung from the roofs of these huts, and one figure sitting in them, with just his head visible watching me, proved to be the old man that I'd been following. He gestured to the ground beneath him, and I found a banana leaf there with food on it, steaming hot. I'm not sure what it was, but it was delicious. I ate it with my hands, briefly setting down my precious laptop, and then licked my hands clean. I remember sitting back on the packed dirt of the compound and surveying my surroundings. The old man was dozing in front of me, and there did not seem to be anyone else about. It was darker now, but through the clear sky above and the remnants of the fire in the pit at the center of the compound, I found enough light to navigate. I decided to explore the huts in front of me, skipping the one with the sleeping man's hammock, and found in the first hut I peeked into all 4 of my friends napping happily in hammocks of their own, with the 5th one empty. Inviting. I found a jug of water at the entrance of the hut and drank greedily. I set it back onto the packed dirt floor, climbing gently into the vacant hammock, and slept. You might have felt upon reading this, dear reader, that naturally I would have immediately awakened my friends, so elated I was at seeing them, listened to their stories and embraced them as they would have embraced me, but such was not the case. I was happy at seeing them, but so much just was assumed by your narrator at the time that I just did not need to listen to the story for confirmation. I somehow knew that this old man had led them to this place after he somehow had found them, and then he set out to find me and bring me to them. I suppose I might have thought that he was the only person alive here, stranded like us, and that our voices, quiet though they were, somehow had arrived at his lonely ears, and he'd set out to find us and bring us to safety. I had acquired somehow a feeling of faith at this point in my life that steered my thinking into areas you might well think queer. I just knew that there was safety here, security. I believe my companion sensed this too, for we did not struggle as we could have for repairing the radio, lighting bonfires to signal potential rescuers, or even formally planning any kind of preparations for an eventual rescue. We just somehow knew things would be all right, and sure enough they were for now. We had shelter, we had companionship, we had food, water, and given our circumstances, I'm sure you can understand our weariness and readiness for comfort, whatever the source. Thus I let them rest, as they did me. You might think that the old man that led me through the jungle could have had plans to ransom us or enslave us for all we knew. But so otherworldly was this adventure I was just now starting to experience, you must understand that all feeling for context had been stripped away. I felt more that he could very well have been a guardian angel taking us under his wing. He pulled me out of the storm of my self-imposed disparity to rest quiet for a time, like a submarine steadily making way beneath the churning waves of a hurricane. This is how I rested in my hammock at any rate, far from the doubts, questions, panic that logic should have placed there. I just felt trust, almost as if it was innate, in the care of this stranger and his lodging. I did not hesitate at the food offered or the quality of the water. I never hesitated to lie in that hammock. I slept easily, not cautiously listening to any suspicious noise of danger. I just knew he was good by his eyes, and my spirit was at ease. This too was a lesson I was to learn, and I learned it quickly. Trust in others first. This world was proving to be so different from the one I'd left, but like the forest differing from the lawn, it was made up of the same elements as my world. Just that this world, not being so combed and ordered, somehow, in being wild, was more welcoming to our spirits, quieting to our souls. Fear and distrust we seemed to have lost in that first fog which shielded our vision back in the Caribbean. It was as if we found something of value by losing everything of value we'd known. My thoughts were far from my students at this time. I was grateful to be alive, safe, and resting. Chapter 4. Atlantis. When I awoke it was morning, and I found my friends already up in the compound enjoying a kind of a soup from a large pot on coals I somehow had missed the night before. There were several more men similar in attire to the old man, but somehow seeming younger, less wise and toughened by time. There were 7 of them, our hosts, and the old man was not there. It would be some time before I would see him again. I spoke with my friends, although not in any way you might imagine. We rarely spoke, and they even less to one another. Speaking seemed to be discouraged and somehow disadvantageous, at least speaking for the sake of conversation, such as is our custom. These first few days, we were ashore, we were very quiet ones. I spoke almost uniquely, with very brief 1- and 2-word responses being replied. I remember asking D when they had left the boat and started for here, and having him reply, "Early." The conversations would go something like this, if I recall. "Did the old man awaken you?" "No." "You were awake? When did you get here?" Only to be given a smile in response. None of us had watches. Even the captain seemed to be content just sipping the soup from coconut shells, just observing the quiet, methodical mannerisms of our hosts as they cleaned a homemade net full of fish and shellfish someone had brought from the beach for supper. They were preparing quite a feast, it appeared. The preparations for the feast continued throughout the day. 1 or 2 of them would disappear, reappearing sometime later with roots, leaves to season the soup. Slowly the fish and shellfish were prepared, parts to be cooked over the fire, eaten with parts tossed into the soup. We snacked through the day and had the stew throughout the evening, almost in complete quiet. We went back to our hammocks upon the fall of the sun and the encroachment of night. I remember thinking in my hammock that there were no children. This observation caught me by surprise. No children, no women. Surely this encampment was some kind of temporary arrangement, separate from the ordinary lives they led. They must come here as a kind of a retreat from time to time, perhaps waiting for someone, some event or resource to be acquired, to be taken back to the main tribe. Everyone looked to be in their 20s, maybe young 30s, but the skin wrinkled from the sun. Their hands, though, were soft. I found that interesting. They never spoke to each other except in briefest whispers. Quiet ruled my world those first few days. But in my curiosity got the better of me, and soon I was following my hosts around the compound, watching them in their daily activities. They smiled and slowed down their movements to show me how the net was constructed as they cleaned and repaired it. They showed me with their knife, made from a shell it looked like, and how they cut open the fish to clean it for cooking. They showed me in exaggerated slowness how to make a fish hook out of a fish bone, how to make a knife blade out of a specific type of shell, how to make rope and strands for the net from tree bark. I learned how to climb coconut trees and tell how ripe from not yet. They ate no bananas, I can recall, but other fruits deeply sweet and plentiful, if you knew where to look. Berries could be found, although the bushes were thin and difficult to spot. I enjoyed their schedule. They would sleep through the night, awaken at dawn, and prepare nets, fishing gear, and head off to catch the night's meal. Others would go off in the forest and return on occasion with small animals they would trap with snares made from the rope and fishing strand nets. In the evening we would have some kind of soup or stew from the day's catch, getting by on various fruits and coconut during the day. Fresh water seemed to always be available, although I honestly never saw any streams or well. They just seemed to always have a full jug of water made by some hollow gourd or an animal skin pouch. These people lived in a kind of a harmony with the environment. They rose with the sun and slept with its departing. They ate mostly during the cool of the evening and worked in the water or the surf or cool of the thick forest during the hottest part of the day. In the cool of the morning they snacked on naturally occurring food sources, edible roots and shoots, berries and fruits, coconut, while preparing traps and nets for the afternoon food gathering, their only real work time. Usually during the gathering of foods in the heat of the day they would find a quiet shaded place and nap a little, passing by the hottest hour or two of the afternoon dozing. I began to learn a little vocabulary during these excursions and while watching them work in the cool of the morning. When learning the word for fishhook, made ironically, I thought, from the jawbone of a large spiny fish, ground into shape by patiently grinding against some bare rock near the surf, I realized it was similar in sound to the word for the action of pulling the thread through the net. Thus I believe these words both were verbs somehow linked to the concept of pulling, to the hook, and the action of threading the net. Both pulled things through something. The word for net was what anchored itself in my consciousness, for it was a compound word combining the pulling through and life of the forest and the surf. The net pulled life and was the same word they gave to the simple traps they used for the small animals of the forest. Both pulled life from the world into their possession. These objects gave them life. These people were very patient with your narrator for his inquisitiveness. I found it difficult to learn their language because they had so few words for what you and I know as nouns. Everything was to them as an action, for their world offered little real permanence. The bark of the tree was a compound word giving them their net, giving them the pulling of life. The surf itself, the action of the waves, I believe, was a related word to the pulling through, which for them had pulled them through the world in times past. The waves pulled them as the nets and traps pulled life, as their hands pulled threads through the fabric of their nets. Yet there was a permanence in their world, but this type of security was nothing you or I would call concrete or the traditional noun. Their world was based on much more pure concepts than sensory information. They seemed to rely on the ageless wisdom of countless generations, all living as they were, in harmony with the world, life among life, days passing through like waves on the sand, lives passing through like threads on the net. Everything was either a pulling of something towards them, acquisition, or pushing away from something, a kind of defiance from something otherwise inevitable. Their concepts seem to be based on the action of the waves, pushing into the earth and then pulling away. It took me some time before I started to see that the entire world behaves in a similar fashion, not just the waves of the surf. They taught me to make net out of the crude fibers from the trees, but while they were teaching me the skill of net making, they were also trying to teach me some sort of concept. I believe, although I do not understand their words exactly, I believe they saw their net as a kind of allegory for society as a whole. Through gestures, I think I understood that a simple knot between two fibers was a connection between two people. A good knot was like a trusted friend. But that fiber, although longer, could not be used for much. But it's that fiber containing two people deeply connected in trust. If that fiber were connected to other fibers containing deep trusting relationships, i.e. good knots, then a net could be formed which would sustain the whole community. So I think they were trying to show me that a good net, like a good society, was fruitful if the knots were good. A society was fruitful and lasting if the relationships between the people were firm and bound on trust. It seemed like everything they taught me had a deeper meaning, but crude as my vocabulary was. I only remember this net lesson as one that I clearly understood. They were silent with me for a time about the net, but soon I was learning more. It was more than a week later when one young man took my hand, pulling me away from a rope-making session, and led me into the forest for a few steps. He stopped and crouched down, clearing away the foliage of the earth. He'd cleared away a small circle at the center of which was a new seedling of some sort, just peeking out from the soil, with the seed coat still attached. He stroked the green stem of the young plant and uttered a word, the first word I'd heard spoken in some time without me having to work it out of someone. He pointed to the earth and scooped up some dirt in his hands and dropped it, then pointed to the seedling again and repeated the word. I repeated his word, pointing to the plant, but he did not seem pleased. I then gripped some dirt in my hand, dropped it, and then pointed to the plant again and repeated the word. The young man beamed with glee. I had learned their word for life. Atlantis. Land seemed to be their word for earth, or dirt, although the sand and rocks on the beach were also land. Driftwood, empty shells were also land. The at and tis parts would fit around other nouns as my vocabulary grew, and just meant progressing through, from the outside, of, and coming through. Their concept of life, which applied to our bodies also, embraced the idea that our bodies involve a process whereby we absorb nutrients and substance from the earth through secondary sources like plants, and give off waste back to the earth, continuously changing, as does the little green seedling, in a process. Therefore, we're not really nouns, objects, like in a concrete sense, but more like verbs passing through this world of something other. This little green shoot, this seedling, was Atlantis. I am Atlantis. The forest, Atlantis. Existence pushing into and transcending beyond non-existence. Thus I learned within the first couple of weeks with these people that their reality, their lives, and all their experience was framed around two actions, pushing and pulling. They pulled from the abundant resources available to them, tools necessary to ease the gathering of life, living things for the extension of their own lives. Life gives them life. This they keenly understood. The ocean itself could pull them as they pulled life from the earth, as if the ocean were conscious, and they were pulling them as they pulled fish and other animals, in a larger vision than they could understand, as the animals they pulled would not understand their actions. The ocean's consciousness transcended their thoughts, as theirs was beyond the animals. Later I would understand that the actions of this world could pull them, but the ocean was more immediate, obvious, and easy to demonstrate to one so young and learning as I proved to be. Yet life was, by its very nature, a wholly separate function, a pushing into, not pulling from. The world was a dead vortex of changing materials. They knew that rocks changed into sand and that somehow the earth digested sand to vomit out new rock from volcanoes. They knew the cycles of the natural world, yet life acted in a reverse fashion. Life pushed. As my education grew, I began to see myself and the other examples of life around me in a new way. No longer were earth and water, even sunlight, just vague concepts in my environment, but tools which, when properly assembled, created conditions that allowed life to puncture through this world and exist for a time. Everything that was not living rocks, sand, mountains, even decaying bodies of once living things, slowly eroded. Only living things operated in a reverse sequence of construction, assembling instead of destructing, and gathering instead of scattering. Slowly my senses were aware of the vibrant pulsing of life around me. Even the waves crashed against the shore seemed to be like a pulse, a heartbeat, of a great living thing beneath me, around me. The world lived, and I lived as part of it. As my vocabulary grew, I became more able to converse with our hosts, and more distant from my friends. Dee had started to learn their vocabulary, but Stas, Abel, and Benny just seemed to enjoy the environment around them, content to be a part of the vibrant cycle of life, but not anxious to understand it in the way Dee and I were investigating it, through language. Our hosts soon had Stas and Abel going off with them on fishing trips, when they would walk off in the early morning hours with their freshly repaired nets to some unknown destination, then return at dusk with loads of fish in them, draped over their shoulders. Likewise men bearing gifts. Benny seemed occupied with the traps and small animals that supplemented the protein of their diet. It never ceased to amaze me how much they could accomplish with so few words. Stas in particular never spoke to my knowledge since arriving in the compound. Abel and Benny never progressed beyond the single-word utterances, yet there was no feeling of strangeness given to us by our hosts. They seemed to completely welcome us, as if we were long-lost kin, from the first evening of our appearance among them. We never really felt unaccepted. They were amazingly patient, kind, and generous people.